Hi everyone, it's Amy here from the blog I Think Therefore I Teach. Welcome to your next Criminology video. This is for Unit 2, 3.2. So this is the evaluation ones. So let me get us set up. Fabulous. So, evaluate criminological theories. How good are they at explaining the causes of criminality? Now, the criminology theories that we are obviously evaluating is 2.1, 2.2 and 2.3. These videos can also be found in the playlist on YouTube. So this is just evaluating those approaches. Now, on my earlier videos during lockdown, I did evaluate occasionally as I went through. This is now the full evaluation of the areas. You need to know some evaluation. You could get a question in your exam that just says evaluate a sociological approach or evaluate the sociological approach you've applied, for example. So you do need to have an idea of some evaluation for this topic. We will look at each of the theories we have learned and evaluate them. This means looking at how effective they are at explaining the causes of crime. So we're going to look at biological, individualistic and sociological. What does it mean then to evaluate? This is level 3, this is higher level skill that you need to develop. This is not an easy skill. Evaluating is not easy. It's where you pass judgment on how good the theories have been. So you need to have a little bank of words to help you with this. It goes beyond describing or explaining. Look at the strengths and weaknesses, what works with them, what does not work with them, what's good, what's bad, what's convincing, what's unconvincing, what's logical, what's illogical. So it's very, very important, as I said, to have a little bank of words. If you do other subjects that evaluate as well, use the same language. So if you want to, if you study not criminology, this is criminology. If you study psychology, for example, you might want to use words like validity, reliability. They're fabulous. This might involve looking at what evidence there is to support or contradict an idea, and criticisms that might come up from other points of view, and coming to a balanced and reasoned conclusions about the usefulness of the idea. So you have to be able to draw conclusions based on if there's more strengths you can present, then it's probably more logical. If there are more weaknesses, then it's probably less useful or less logical or less convincing. So you can't just sit down the middle and just say these are the strengths and these are the weaknesses. You have to lean and evaluate one more than the other, and that's your job. I cannot tell you whether, I can only present you with some evaluation. You then need to apply them. You need to say where, if there's more strengths and weaknesses, for example. In terms of crime, a theory might explain some kinds of crime better than others. So a few statements or phrases that you might find useful. Sorry, excuse me. A strength of this theory is the theory succeeds in. However, a weakness is, on the other hand, the main problem with this theory is, in support of this theory, evidence to support this theory comes from. So this is just some examples of evaluative phrases. You can use many, many others or many different ones. The slides that are going to come up now only give you that platform for you to take further. I do not use evaluative phrases in the upcoming slides. That's your job to apply the evaluative statements of whether the strengths and weaknesses I'm about to present work or do not work. So, starting right back with 2.1, Lombroso, our physiological theory. The strengths are these, or some of the strengths are these. Lombroso was the first to tackle a scientific, objective approach to understanding crime using evidence. It shows the importance of examining medical and historical records of criminals. Arguing that criminals may not be freely choosing their behaviour helped us focus on crime prevention than punishment, so helping these people rather than just punishing them. He argued that prisons are like crime universities, often having high rates of reoffending, so was very perceptive, and there is some truth to that. Butcher and Taylor shows a person's attractiveness does affect how likely they are to be considered guilty, hence why people like Ted Bundy got away with it for so long. Weaknesses, however, subsequent research by Gore in 1913 has not shown a link between facial features and crime. So obviously Lombroso says things about beaked noses or protruding ears and things leads to people doing certain crimes. Goring saw no such link. Lombroso failed to compare his research on criminals with a control group of non-criminals, so might have found some characteristics among the general population. So there might have been people that weren't criminals with the same features as well. It's a form of racism to say criminals are like primitive savages. Also, DeLisi 2012 points out that a lot of the features deemed atavistic by Lombroso are specific to African descent. And not all people with atavistic features are criminals, and not all criminals have atavistic features. Sheldon, the strengths of Sheldon, some support from other studies, Putwain and Salmons, for example, also found a link between the physique and the criminality. So don't forget, Sheldon's the one that says that mesomorphs, this idea of big, muscular, are more likely to be criminals than the skinny waifs or the very retiring introverts. Gweck and Gweck 1956 found 60% mesomorphs in their sample of delinquents, but only 31% in the sample of non-delinquents. So they found that a high percentage of delinquents did follow the mesomorph physical characteristics. Sheldon used a large sample initially, 200 people, and had a control group of students to compare the results to. So he did do a bit more comparison than Lombroso did. However, Sheldon can't explain how endomorphs and ectomorphs also have criminal tendencies or are criminals. People's bodies change throughout their lives, so mesomorphs is quite a popular look now. You know, people really like going to the gym when they open and things like that, but that doesn't necessarily mean, so when you're a teenager and you're slim and waif-like, that you're not a criminal. You then go to the gym for a few years, bulk up, you're then automatically going to become a criminal as well. Maybe because mesomorphs look the way they do, they're invited or dared to do illegal acts more, so that labelling that they are given. So you expect trouble from people that have certain body shapes, potentially. Could it cause bias and labelling of mesomorphs in court as well, so they look a certain type, so that bias is there? And certainly as well the way that the media or the newspapers, for example, put those labels to people, so they call them certain things based on the way that they physically look, and therefore we start to get that labelling society and culture there. Finally, maybe social class causes offending and mesomorphy. Criminals are more likely to be working class males who tend to do manual jobs needing an athletic build. So again, you've got your labelling theory there. So they're labelled that way rather than just being criminals. They've got a body or a physique like that because of the job that they do, not because they're more likely to be criminals. Brain injuries and abnormalities. Strengths. There are cases where brain injury has led to a dramatic change in personality behaviour. So we're talking here about the front prefrontal cortex damage. There is a correlation, a link between, but correlation is a nice word to use, between abnormal EEG readings and psychopathy. Brain injury is more likely to have happened to prisoners than non-prisoners. However, it's still rare for brain injury or disease to cause crime. Previous personality is more important. Psychopaths can also have normal EEG patterns, and non-criminals can have abnormal ones. It's not clear that EEG patterns explain crime. And also, are brain injuries an effect of crime rather than a cause? So prisoners have a higher likelihood because of getting into fights, etc. So prisoners are more likely to have brain damage, but that's because they scrap a lot in prison, not because they had it like that when they actually did the crime in the first place. Right, so that's for 2.1. You'll probably find more evaluation on the 2.1 video that I did in lockdown, but also you can, of course, research. If you can't find any evaluation for any of the specific areas, just drop me a comment and I'm more than happy to help you. So, Freud's psychodynamic theory. The strengths of Freud. The theory highlights that what happens to us as children or early experiences and socialisation are important, and we know this. We know what happens in childhood is very, very important to a person's development. It suggests family relationships are key. There are similarities between Freud's id and the limbic system and the superego and the prefrontal cortex. So there are scientific biological understandings as well that back up Freud. Freud's therapy of psychoanalysis has been used in the treatment of offenders. So, for example, Acorn used it in a young offenders institution to give them a happy and pleasant experience they may have missed at home to allow development of the superego. So there has been use of this psychoanalytic approach as well to help prisoners. The weaknesses, however, some critics say there is no evidence of the existence of the unconscious mind and the idea is totally unfalsifiable. You can't prove it true or false. Psychodynamic explanations such as Freud's rely on interpretations of people's thoughts and behaviours that cannot be proven. Different analysts might come to different interpretations. It's all very, very subjective. Finally, Freud's case studies are not reliable as he knew his patients. There was a high level of bias. Freud also had it was a very small sample, and all these people that he drew his research from were people that he either had a close relationship with, often intimate relationship with, or there was a very small sample. He also analysed his own dreams and childhood. Bowlby's psychodynamic theory as well. So the strengths are, Bowlby's own research, 39% of his sample of 44 juvenile delinquents had maternal deprivation, compared to only 5% of non-delinquent control groups. So he had a control group, so that's good, and he did find a significantly higher percentage in the delinquents having maternal deprivation than the non-delinquents. His theory and findings show that the parent-child relationship is very important and one key to understanding criminality. However, his study was retrospect, so mothers and young people had to accurately remember the past, so we're talking about it retrospectively, so after it happens, going back in time to remember these things. Why only 61% delinquent? So Bowlby doesn't explain. There must be other factors as well. Why were the other 61? So only 39%. That's really small, actually, is 39% of the 44. So 44 is already a small number. Well, what about the other 61% then that don't correlate to his research? Does Bowlby overestimate the damage caused by early childhood experiences, and does Freud do this too? And Bowlby's latest study of 60 children separated from mothers before the age of 5 did not show them to have affectionless psychopathy. Final section then is for your 2.3 areas and your 2.3 elements. So Marxism, the strengths of Marxism, it shows how poverty and inequality can cause crime in working class and how capitalism can cause greed and crime in upper classes. It also highlights that lawmaking and law enforcement can be biased against the working class, so corporate and white collar crime is often unprosecuted or under-prosecuted, yet working class crimes are often labelled and found guilty before they're found innocent. So it's that bias there. Weaknesses, however, what about other inequalities such as gender and ethnicity? It over-predicts the working class crime, so being poor doesn't necessarily lead you to crime. And finally, not all capitalist societies have high crime rates. For example, Japan and Switzerland have very, very low crime rates. Merton's strain theory, the strength of the strain theory, it shows how the same goals, material success and money, can lead to normal and deviant behaviours. So, for example, conformists and innovators. So you do need to know the 5 of Merton's strain and which ones are more likely to lead to crime. So your innovators linking to the white collar crime. So you do need to know about those. The theory explains statistics that show property crime to be most common, so wealth is valued highly, and crime rates are higher in working class because there's less chance of actually gaining that wealth legitimacy. So there are statistics to show that property crime, so burglary, is a really high crime, and that's because people see things they want and they take it. Weaknesses, however, it over-predicts working class crime and ignores crime of the wealthy. It ignores the deviance of subcultures. It sees deviance as only an individual response to the strain rather than a group response to a strain. It also focuses on certain crimes such as property, but what about crimes that have no material motivation? What about crimes that you get nothing back from? It doesn't explain those crimes. Oh, didn't time this one. This is for Durkheim and Functionalism. The strengths are Durkheim was the first to notice that crime can actually have positive functions such as reinforcing community boundaries and uniting people against the wrongdoer. I find Durkheim quite an interesting approach really with Functionalism because it's a bit different. You wouldn't really put crime, because crime is such a negative and bad thing, down to having a function, whereas Durkheim does that. And whilst that function might be trying to find the silver lining or making lemonade out of lemon sort of thing, there is still potentially some function there. So even when we did Durkheim back on 2.3 and we talked about the James Bulger case, but how Liverpool banded together and how laws were looked at, such as what age of responsibility can someone be convicted at, and how society came together round that crime. So that served as a function of moving forward. However, the problems are Durkheim thought society needed a bit of deviance to function, but he didn't help specify how much is enough, how much deviance is required, and what levels of deviance. Crime may also have positive functions, but that's not for the victims. So even if the James Bulger case brings some function to society, that doesn't help James's mum at all to deal with the death of her son. Interactionism and labelling theory. It highlights that police and others in society create crime by applying labels based on stereotypes or typifications. This may explain why certain groups seem to have a higher crime rates, working class minority groups, due to the bias in policing. It also highlights the role of media in defining and creating deviance. So I've gone over these a little bit in some previous PowerPoints as well. The weakness is not everyone who is labelled lives up to that label. So just because you're a teenager and you're labelled a teenager doesn't mean you're going to go and, race cars and steal old ladies' handbags and things. That's not going to happen. Just because you have that label doesn't mean you're going to live up to that label. It makes the offender have victim status. Oh, well, I was labelled that way. I couldn't help it. I'm not responsible for it. But what about the real victims? It doesn't explain why people commit primary deviance before they are labelled. So this talks about primary and secondary deviance, then the master status, but secondary deviance is, we've already been given that label, so I might as well fulfil now and have a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it doesn't explain why the person does the crime that deviance in the first place, that primary deviance. It doesn't explain why the labels are applied to certain groups and not others. So, for example, as we've already said, you label working class rather than people, middle-class people with high-paying jobs that wear suits all day, but they're likely to be dealing with maybe things like fraud. We don't label them as much, though, as other people. Right realism, nearly there folks, stay with me. Right realism, the strengths, it helps to produce and shape government research into crime. So for example, victim surveys and practical ways to combat crime. It's more practical in tackling crime, not just theoretical. So it's not just about theory, it's about what do we do? This is the issue, how do we move forward? Research by Flood and Page, 2000, supports the view of the decline of the family. Children from lone parent families, so single parent families, and step families, especially males, are more likely to offend. Weaknesses, it ignores wider structural causes of crime like poverty. It ignores increasing gap between rich and the poor and the resentment this may cause. It's too focused on young males and street crime statistics. It misses white collar, for example, so the higher crimes. Finally, left realism, the strengths of left realism. It draws attention to the effects of poverty, inequality and relative deprivation in crime. Draws attention to the reality of crime and its effects, especially on victims from deprived groups. However, Henry and Milivanovic, it's a terrible pronunciation I'm sure, point out that it does not explain white collar and corporate crime. So yeah, well spotted. It over-predicts working class crime and can make it seem that inner city crime rates are normal. This is not representative of the wider scale or the bigger scale. So this topic is a little bit drier, so I do apologise for that. Hopefully this video has helped you a little bit though in getting a few strengths and weaknesses ideas that you can then take further, but pretty much your own judgment on these areas of whether they do or don't work. And don't forget, you have to apply your own evaluative language to these, and you need to decide, are you for or against these theories? Are you more a sociological approach to explaining crime? Are you more individualistic? Do you think Skinner is better than Freud? Do you think biological? Do you think Sheldon is better than Lombroso? Who is better? So it's about weighing up your arguments. So definitely prepare for this one, because it will be on your exam in multiple places. You do need to know how to evaluate. So hopefully this has helped. Give me a thumbs up if it has helped. Don't forget, drop me a comment as well if you do have any questions, and subscribe just to make sure that you don't miss out on any future videos. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye for now, folks. Bye for now.